Hey everybody! This is the second video in my 4-part series where I'm just telling you some meandering little stories about YouTube conservatism. This time we're talking about Jordan Peterson. And just as a disclaimer, if you're a fan of Peterson's who's bothered by the fact that I've categorized him as a conservative, I really wouldn't worry about it too much. I'll explain more in a footnote that I've written, but I really wouldn't worry about it, just take a walk on the wild side, entertain a Big Joel video. And with that, let's get started. So, when I was in my first semester of college, I read T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland in an introductory English class. While the poem is renowned for being complicated, filled with allusions to canonical works, different languages, archetypal figures, pretentious stuff like that, I think the basic story Eliot tells is a simple one. The world around us is a wasteland. In the wake of World War I, and under the crushing weight of modernity, we have found ourselves fragmented and without moral center.
What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images.
As the poem progresses, we navigate this world, one fixated on image, but image without substance. We have taken the narratives that give our lives meaning and purpose and replaced them with easily consumable trash.
Are you alive or not? Is there nothing in your head? But oh, that Shakespearean rag, it's so elegant, so intelligent.
There is no water here, no spiritual sustenance, no way to create meaning. It's a wasteland. So naturally, we're left with a question. How do we get out of it? And the answer Eliot gives is, we have to fix ourselves. See, this poem is, at its core, a Fisher King narrative from Arthurian legend. The kingdom is in disrepair because the king is injured. And to become well again, to make the world well again, the king must hear the right words. In this case, data dayadvam damyata. Translated from Sanskrit, we must give, sympathize, and control. This is how we can leave the wasteland, can heal the kingdom. And at the very least, by holding close to these ideals, we can set our own lands in order. We can shore some fragments against the ruins.
I sat upon the shore, fishing, with the arid plain behind me. Shall I at least set my lands in order?
So, I loved this poem. I loved reading it and hearing what the professor had to say. I think it hit me at the right time in my life, and it's just one of those things that pops into my mind every few weeks. Data dayadvam damyata. In general, I just think they're really good words to live by, and there's something so pleasing and elegant in their message. What's more, and I know this is kind of personal, but The Wasteland reminds me of my dad, who died around 6 months ago. Not just because my dad loved T.S. Eliot when he was around my age, and loved pretentious stuff, and loved talking about archetypes, but also because I don't think he was a particularly happy man. I don't want to get too deep into this stuff, and I don't want to present you some biased image of my father, but he was generally pretty invested in his problems, in his discomfort and social anxiety, in his feeling that the world was pitted against him. What's more, he put a lot of stock in the idea that he could find some big solution to those problems. He was very invested in Buddhism and psychoanalysis and self-help books. And so, after he died, I almost immediately began to connect his life to the story of the Fisher King. To me it seemed that, like the Fisher King, my father was injured, that his world was injured because of it, and that he was on a quest to find the words that would heal him. And I wondered, what would have been the right words for him? What would have healed his kingdom? And maybe Eliot was right. Maybe what my father needed to hear and listen to was as simple as give, sympathize, control. I don't know. So why did I start off this video with this incredibly long and annoying intro? Well, it's because I wanted to explain why, on some level, I'm attached to this stuff. This language was useful to me in my life, and it reminds me of my dad. And the reason that's important is that if it turns out that the ideology of the Wasteland doesn't work, if there's something in it that we can't accept, if we can't look to it for all of our answers, then there's something to mourn here, right? And maybe I'm the only one who feels that way, but something tells me I'm not. Anyway, over the last few months, I've watched a lot of videos by Jordan Peterson, and this is a story about that. There's a really interesting video by Jordan Peterson that we'll be kind of focusing on today. A 2-hour lecture uploaded on his channel called Identity Politics and the Neo-Marxist Lie of White Privilege. And the first important thing I want to point out about this lecture is that Jordan Peterson doesn't provide any kind of real argument against the existence of white privilege. Doesn't ever work to prove that it's a lie. I mean, sure, he says a few words about how there are tons of factors that predict success in America and that race isn't the only one.
I can't quite figure out why the postmodernists have made the canonical distinctions they've made. Race, ethnicity, sexual proclivity, sexual gender identity, let's say. Those are 4 dimensions along which people vary. But there's a very large number of dimensions along which people vary. Here's some ways people differ. Intelligence, temperament, geography, historical time. You live now and not 100 years ago. Attractiveness, that's a big one.
But, you know, that's a given, right? Nobody thinks that being black or white is the only thing that matters in a person's life. That's ridiculous. Instead, they believe that race is an unimportant factor in the way that a person will be treated in our society, and that is an unjust thing. Or, at a few points, he suggests that the scholarship trying to prove that white privilege exists is inadequate. And this is, of course, the one thing he'd have to show to prove that white privilege is a lie, but he never really commits to that argument in a more robust way. He just, isolates a personal, intentionally non-data-driven perspective on white privilege and is like, wee-oo, I'm the science police, that's personal and not even data-driven, woo.
The original paper on white privilege wouldn't have received a passing grade for the hypothesis part of an undergraduate honors thesis. We're not even close. There's no methodology at all. It was called White Privilege and Male Privilege. A personal account of coming to see correspondences through work in women's studies.
But he seems to outright ignore the amount of credible information we have on this subject that might be more compelling to him. What's wrong with the study indicating that black names on resumes are turned over far more often than white names are? Were the sample sizes just too small on that one? How about the historical and economic analysis claiming that property discrimination had a direct impact on the ability of black people to accrue wealth in America? How about the literally dozens of papers about how black people are treated unfairly on basically every level of the American justice system? Boop, 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 boop. And I could keep going here, but the important thing is Peterson never addresses any of this stuff. It's not that I disagree with his interpretation of this robust research, rather, he just doesn't make an argument about it in the first place. Probably the case he devotes most of his time to making is that white privilege and its postmodern ilk is the modern form of militant totalitarian communism. Basically, he thinks that in order to maintain the lie that communism could work after the horrors of Stalinism took its toll, academics who wanted to continue advocating for Marxism had to replace their discussion of class struggle with things like identity politics and intersectionality.
So much data on the catastrophic failures of communism had accrued that even the most intransigent of French intellectuals had to admit that the jig was up. But that's a problem, because that's the whole ideology. You're going to just give that up? What are you going to do after that? Well, what happened was postmodernism was invented. And so it's a sleight of hand, as far as I can tell. And and with postmodernism identity politics.
And while I don't think his thesis here is strong at all, while I actually think it's deeply misleading, we can see that it doesn't much matter here, right? Because even if he's absolutely right about the history of terms like intersectionality and white privilege, that's still not an argument against those ideas. If systemic racism does exist, and to be clear, it does, then it exists, and it doesn't really matter if the people talking about it are trying to pull some strange Marxist bait and switch. Concepts aren't true or untrue based upon the supposedly shifty ideologues who say them. Now, I could give a few more examples here, but I think you see the point. And I sincerely hope you believe me when I say that I'm not ignoring the secret, real argument that Jordan Peterson makes in order to make my own narrative stronger. There would be no point to that. I'm not really invested in shaming the guy in the first place. No. What I want to do is ask a question. Why does it not matter that Jordan Peterson never makes a real argument against white privilege? Why is his lecture nonetheless kind of captivating? Why is the audience eating out of the palm of his hand, likely to agree with him about this topic? And this is, broadly speaking, the question that I'll be spending the rest of this video exploring. And to do that, let's return to the Wasteland. I don't think it should take long to convince you that Jordan Peterson essentially wants to be a modern T.S. Eliot. It sounds weird, but it's not all that surprising. Eliot himself was pretty far on the right, even calling himself a royalist. Like Eliot, Peterson believes that the world is losing its grasp on what really matters.
We don't have much respect for tradition in the West, and it's a really, really big problem because the ethical responsibility of a human being is to take the dead culture, so that's the dead father or the dead God, and to revivify it with attention and communication.
And like Eliot, Peterson comes to the conclusion that our response to this must be to take that meaning back in a very personal way. Regain an appreciation for the traditional and healthy modes of being. Assume responsibility, sit up straight, clean your room. At their core, Jordan Peterson's politics are a politics of psychology. To him, we are all Fisher Kings, and by far the most important thing we can do is to heal ourselves, set our houses in order.
In the play The Cocktail Party by American English poet T.S. Eliot, one of the characters is having a very hard time of it. She speaks of her profound unhappiness to her psychiatrist. She tells him that she hopes her suffering is all her own fault. Taken aback, the psychiatrist asks why. Because, she tells him, if it's her fault, she can do something about it. If it's in the nature of the world, however, she's doomed. She can't change everything else, but she could change herself.
We can see this idea come through clearly in a video called I've Read Some Marx and Now I'm Gonna Change the World. In it, a student interviewer basically asks Peterson if he thinks activism is a good thing. And Peterson reacts to this question with a mix of skepticism and derision.
You know, you go out there with a stick and a sign on it that says, I'm against poverty. It's like, yeah, no kidding, man. Really. Like, who's for poverty? No one's for poverty. So it's an abdication of responsibility with the mask of social virtue.
Seemingly, the vast majority of activists are inauthentic and silly. They use gauche and overly public stances as a way to virtue signal to their friends and avoid the bigger problems in their lives. You want to solve a difficult problem, is you figure out how to get along with your brother, the one you've been fighting with for 5 years, or see if you can staple your family back together. See if you can stop fighting with your girlfriend and have a relationship that lasts for more than 2 weeks. What's more, most of these people aren't meaningfully helping anyway. While he's not opposed to civil action outright, he thinks that we shouldn't tamper with the functioning of the world until we are competent enough to do so. And competence is a surprisingly restrictive quality to Peterson. And they're usually people, well, they've had a successful relationship, they've had a successful family, they have a couple of degrees, they've established a business, like they've made themselves credible in 5 or 6 dimensions. Well, then maybe you know enough about the world to dare to mess with its internal mechanisms. And if you don't have that kind of in-depth knowledge, then you shouldn't
You should no more work on the economic systems of Western civilization than you should try to adjust the electronic systems of your automobile.
And this idea crops up over and over again in Peterson's work. Like, say what you want about the guy, he does not hide the high premium he places on personal psychology or the disdain he has for people who look to the problems of society. It's something any fan of his would immediately recognize. And looking at this, considering the fact that I am probably the sort of person that Jordan Peterson is expressing a distaste for, it only makes sense that he made me think about my own psychology, about what I'm doing here. See, I've always wanted to work with media, either making it or talking about it. I just love the stuff and have since I was a kid. And I like to think that now that I've had this amazing opportunity to make these videos, that I've been a fairly decent person about it, that I've had integrity. I've never said something I don't believe to be true. I've never intentionally mischaracterized somebody. You know, stuff like that. But still, are my motives pure? Does my work come from some perfect, healthy, helpful place? Well, no, I don't think so. I like attention, plain and simple. I like getting money for being creative. I like feeling smart and correct about things, assembling an in-group of people who agree with me. And I'm not, like, qualified to be that kind of person, right? I don't have multiple degrees. I'm not a policy expert. Nobody asked me to give my opinions when I first started. I volunteered them. At the end of the day, I love making videos, but it is a constant source of insecurity in my life. One defined both by the unending desire to be well-liked and accepted, and by the realization that nothing makes me fit to this task. That there's no big reason I should be doing it. This is, I think, the power of Jordan Peterson. His ability to confront me, and I imagine much of his audience, with their own sense of angst and inner longing. The realization that there is an absence inside of us, one that takes up so much of our lives, and that reminds us that we are not good, not pure, not well-intentioned in some idealized way. And we won't find our answers to these problems in the issues of society, right? There is no policy change, no activism, no socialist utopia that's gonna get us out of this wasteland. So why look to those issues in the first place? Now, I don't think it should surprise you that ultimately, I can't live thinking this way. I find it completely inadequate, and there's lots of arguments I could make to try to convince you that I'm right about that. Like, sure, I can agree that most people are broken and incompetent in one way or another, but I don't think that's a good reason to suggest that we not engage in politics and activism until we have solved those personal problems. After all, this is the fundamental cornerstone of democracy, either direct or indirect, that everybody should have an active voice in the way that power operates. And I don't think that democracy is good because people are good, because they always know the best course of action we should take. No, I think it's good because I don't trust anybody else to handle that power better. The small businessman with 5 degrees might be a good leader. I don't know him. But I'm not just gonna hitch my horse to his wagon because he's happy and has made a good life for himself. Rather, he needs to persuade me that he's gonna do the right things. And the only way he's gonna do that is if we both have political convictions that we care about and believe in, that we basically agree on what ought to be done. So I'm not saying that everybody's great or has to be a leader, but limiting civic engagement, concern, and activism to so-called competent people just doesn't work for me. Or sure, I could say, it seems like for a lot of us, our problems aren't caused by society, but by our own psychologies. But that's one of those unfalsifiable claims that sounds good on paper, but is really hard to make categorical statements about. And let's take the standard example here. A guy, let's call him Slobber, works at various retail jobs for 60 hours a week. He doesn't like what he does, and he doesn't make a lot doing it. Meanwhile, his marriage is falling apart. Lately, things have felt strained. He isn't as present as he used to be, and his wife is becoming increasingly unhappy about it. Now, just looking at this guy and his marriage, are there things he can do to make himself happier and make his relationship better? Well, of course there are. I'm not the ghoul of despair, here to take away Slobber's hopes from him, and I believe there are probably a number of things he can do to make his marriage better. But that doesn't mean we can't ask broader questions about his situation. Like, is his lack of presence at home because of a deep psychological failing on his part? Or because he spends most of his life doing work that he finds torturous? Is his wife mad because he just doesn't have communication skills? Or does his lack of ability in this area come from the fact that he's constantly worried about paying the bills because his work pays next to nothing? See, Slobber should work on his life and marriage. I hope he does. But we don't need to confine our appraisal of his situation to that statement alone. His well-being is inextricably linked to the society around him, to the way that him and others like him are treated. And as such, if social problems exist, then solving them will help Slobber. Or I could say the obvious point that I've already alluded to, that even accepting that everything Jordan Peterson says is true, it's just not enough to change the way that facts work. If I say a fact about the world we live in, and you respond that I suck and my house isn't in order, well, you might be right about that, but it doesn't challenge anything that I said. And, you know, that's the main thing I'm gonna need to hear to be convinced that I'm wrong. And look, I think those arguments are all pretty compelling, but here's the problem. In the scope of Jordan Peterson's analysis, they are rendered irrelevant, because each of them, in one way or another, requires an engagement with what I'll call, a term I personally coined right now and that you can't steal, the sociological imagination. Our ability to situate ourselves, not just as individuals, but also as nodes in a complex society and culture. If we're gonna talk about the importance of democracy, or about Slobber, or about the way that facts work, we first need to accept that that stuff is important to our lives, that attending to it might give us something of value. But the central thrust of Peterson's work is to obfuscate that possibility space. And so, in a very real way, I'm left without a foot to stand on here. What's more, it's undeniable that Peterson's narrative is a deeply appealing one. For one thing, it just feels really good. Like, okay, it's painful to think that my problems are my own, that the only thing standing in my way is my own failings. But it's painful in the good way, like hydrogen peroxide on a scraped knee. When you're a 24-year-old white straight guy who's incredibly online, there's worse things to hear than you suck and you can make your life better by doing good things.
You want to solve a difficult problem, is you figure out how to get along with your brother, the one you've been fighting with for 5 years, or see if you can staple your family back together. See if you can stop fighting with your girlfriend and have a relationship that lasts for more than 2 weeks.
It's certainly true in my case, and so reducing all of society to that conclusion has a pleasant and intuitive logic to it. But maybe more importantly, Jordan Peterson here is giving us one of the most priceless things imaginable, the gift of social apathy, the capacity to think and say rational things, but to not really care where that rationality might lead us. Obviously, climate change is a substantial global threat that we should work to ameliorate. Obviously. But if you're talking about it and you're not an expert, you're probably using this pseudo-moralistic stance to avoid other, more personal problems. An all-important observation to Jordan Peterson.
The climate, the global warming problem on the climate is something that needs to be tackled quickly, and they can't wait until they grow up and become prime ministers to do it. Do you think collective responsibility overrides individual responsibility in a huge issue like that?
No.
Okay.
I think generally people have things that are more within their personal purview that are more difficult to deal with and that they're avoiding, and that generally the way they avoid them is by adopting pseudo-moralistic stances on large-scale social issues so that they look good to their friends and their neighbors.
Or, obviously, the gays should be able to get married, but not if the whiners are talking about it.
Australia is holding a plebiscite on whether to legalize gay marriage. I'm against the Yes campaign, but only because it's backed by cultural Marxists. I'm curious to hear your views on gay marriage. Well, I would be against it too if it was backed by cultural Marxists, because it isn't clear to me that it will satisfy the ever-increasing, what would you call it, demand for an assault on traditional modes of being. Now, with regards to gay marriage specifically, that's a really tough one for me, because if the marital vows are taken seriously, then it seems to me that it's a means whereby gay people can be integrated more thoroughly into standard society, and that's probably a good thing.
They're trying to uproot the traditional social roles that help me in some abstract way. And since postmodernists won't be happy even if they get what they want, and since I don't actually care about society treating gay people fairly and equitably, screw them. The gays can get what they want. That's fine. But is it too much to ask that they want it for the reasons that I tell them to? Is it too much to ask that they stay in their fucking lanes? And finally returning to his 2-hour lecture, obviously Jordan Peterson doesn't have a real argument against the existence of white privilege. To have one of those, he'd have to examine about 1 million credible sources and come to the rigorous conclusion that they're all wrong. So instead of doing that, he'll cede at some point that racism probably does exist.
It's like racism. People are kind of racist. Or maybe people prefer their in-group. It's not that easy. Or maybe people prefer the familiar to the novel.
But we all have privileges, don't we? And the impact of systemic racism isn't total, is it? And besides, that whole concept comes from people who advocate for a communist dictator, who hate the idea that individuals are important and complicated and should be treated with care. Prove that he's wrong on that one, or don't. It couldn't matter less. Jordan Peterson doesn't have to prove that white privilege is a lie because it is an assumption baked into the fabric of his work. If white privilege does exist, if people's lives and identities are informed by grand systems that are sometimes very unjust, then there is a world to care about that goes far beyond our own suffering and sadness and chaos. And we can't or don't want to think that, so it must all be a Marxist lie. I'm not going to pretend to be an authority on anything. I'm not your boss. I don't have an inroad to your soul, and frankly, I'm not trying to get one. So instead of asking you to renounce the work of Jordan Peterson and embrace me instead, I want to close this video by talking about one moment that I found really striking. Toward the middle of his lecture, Jordan Peterson invokes a passage of George Orwell's The Road to Wigan Pier, where he describes an impoverished woman working in the mining industry.
I had time to see everything about her. Her sack apron, her clumsy clogs, her arms reddened by the cold. She looked up as the train passed, and I was almost near enough to catch her eye. She had a round, pale face, the usual exhausted face of the slum girl who's 25 and looks 40 thanks to miscarriages and drudgery, and it wore, for the second in which I saw it, the most desolate, hopeless expression I've ever seen. It struck me then that we, meaning the middle class at that time, are mistaken when we say that it isn't the same for them as it would be for us, and that people bred in the slums can imagine nothing but the slums. For what I saw in her face was by no means the ignorant suffering of an animal. She knew well enough what was happening to her, understood as well as I did how dreadful a destiny it was to be kneeling there in the bitter cold on the slimy stones of a slum backyard, poking a stick up a foul drain pipe.
This passage is so beautiful and sad, I think. This woman is suffering at the hands of a system that just doesn't care about her. And the most notable thing about her is that she understands that something's wrong here. We like to think that people in the slums can only imagine the slums, but this is not true. She is aware, perhaps innately aware, that this, her life, is not okay. And Jordan Peterson goes on to say the acceptable things for a moment. How can we not want to help this woman? How can we not have compassion?
You have to have a heart of stone if you read that, you don't think, man, something should be done about this. It's really awful.
But after that, Peterson skips forward in the book and quotes George Orwell expressing his distaste for academic socialism, how he thinks they hate the rich more than they love the poor.
It would be a mistake to regard the book-trained socialist as a bloodless creature entirely incapable of emotion. Though seldom giving much evidence of affection for the exploited, he is perfectly capable of displaying hatred, a sort of queer, theoretical, in vacuo hatred against the exploiters. Hence the grand old socialist sport of denouncing the bourgeoisie.
And you can agree with Orwell about this or not. I think his point is probably true to some extent, but it's not too important here. What is important to me about this moment is that this is the last we hear about this woman. He introduces her suffering, talks about how hard her life was, and then he talks about how the people advocating for her life to be better are bad and shouldn't be trusted, and then that's it. No more talk of compassion or of redistribution. Now we've made our points about her, and we can get on to the second half of the lecture, where we talk about how activists are shitty and lying about racism somehow, where we can recycle the same tired line about how we shouldn't give protesters too much credit, and get the same facile laugh from the audience.
I'm against poverty. You know, that's like classic protest sign. It's like, really? It's like, I'm against torture. It's like, it's so obvious. You don't get any brownie points for being against poverty. No one in their right mind is for poverty.
Because to Jordan Peterson, relinquishing brownie points from some hypothetical activists protesting poverty will always be more important than the poverty they protest. No. Within the story of this lecture, the woman's plot is left dangling. In essence, she's still standing there, in that coal mining town in northern England. And you can almost picture Jordan Peterson reading by a lamp that her work helped to fuel. You can imagine him reading the words, Data Diadvam Damyata, give, sympathize, control. And maybe Peterson is comforted by those words, but I don't know if I can be anymore. So that's the video, kind of a long and intense one there, and I hope you liked it. And if you did, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and give me money on Patreon if you want to. And on that note, now's the time for the Patreon question of the video. Savannah Madeira is very impressed, asks, what's your favorite minor holiday? Like, the ones you don't actually celebrate, but still kind of passively exist, like Earth Day. So I'm gonna have to give a really bog standard answer here and say it's Groundhog Day. Obviously, that's the best one, right? Little groundhog, waking up, seeing snow, going back in its little cave. Gonna be more winter, says somebody I've never encountered. Okay, that's it. That's